We begin by saying there are 3 or 4 dates that you need to remember. Well, let's say first that of all the Scottish Rite buildings in the United States, we have 2 very unique things about our building. One is this meeting room and the Egyptian decorations in it. The other is the set of stage curtains that we have upstairs. These cannot be surpassed anywhere and are very seldom equaled anywhere. But this room is unique because of things that happened. First date I want you to remember is 1799. The First Republic of France had just been formed when their revolution came in 1779, 3 years after our revolution in America. And France was again at war with England, as was ever so often they had to go to war with each other. And they met on the fields of Egypt. While they were there, a man named Broussard was digging around up in a little town called Rosetta, and he found an interesting stone. It was a black basalt, and it had 3 running inscriptions of some events that had happened back when the Greeks were involved in Egypt. The first was in hieroglyphics. The second was in sort of a cursory writing of the Egyptians, and the third was in Greek. This is the first evidence we have ever had of something that would give us a clue to these hieroglyphics. You may remember that one of the men on that expedition was a young man named Bonaparte, who was then an officer in the French army, who later became the emperor. Well, France got whipped in that meeting. And so in 1801, when they left the field of Egypt and settled up with Alexandria, they got the right to the Rosetta Stone. It's still in the British Museum. But there was a young man in this group named Champollion, not quite Polonard, but Champollion, who took a copy of the Rosetta Stone with him back to France. And he worked on it diligently from 1801 to 1822. And that year, he broke the code. Is this important? Well, from somewhere about 300 BC until the time that Cleopatra reigned as the last monarch of the ancient Egyptian system, no one, Egyptian or otherwise, could tell you a thing about the Egyptian hieroglyphs or what they said on these great monuments and in all of these tombs of the pharaohs. For the first time in 1822, we had a means of decoding the Egyptian history. And I can tell you today that we know almost as many dates about the various dynasties of pharaohs in Egypt as we know about the Roman emperors, and that's pretty good. And it's important to know those dates because I'll give you a way of dating them later. Well, let's move on then to 1922. That year, 2 things happened. One very personal. I got born up here at Santa Fe. The other was that a man named Carter, with the backing of Lord Cavernon of England and his money, knew that there was a tomb that belonged to a young king named Tutankhamun. He couldn't find it, and he was just about desperate to leave Egypt because his money was running out when somebody told him about some rocks that led down instead of into a cave. And he dug it out, and the richest find of Egyptian equipment and material that has ever existed was found in that tomb. Now, they're probably richer treasures, but they were all rifled, because as soon as a king was buried, Pharaoh was buried, the robbers would get busy and relieve him of any of his treasures. Why is that important to this building? Because it started a wave of love of things Egyptian. All of a sudden, in New Orleans, when I was stationed there, you won't run around the cemetery and there are tombs built like pyramids. There are plain tombs with sphinx leading into them. There are stained glass windows with Egyptian designs in them. The country went wild. When did we build this building? 28 and 29. Just a few years after Carter had discovered all of this. So that's why we have this rich room. It was a popular decorum for the time. Now, what does it mean? Well, Scottish Rite, we have some degrees that deal with some of the Egyptian themes. The most important thing in here is first the round disc. They're orange. That represents the sun. Its name is Ra, or Aten. It is the symbol of the source of all life. And while they were not monotheists, they did know that there was one God over all and that all the other gods were subservient to him. So the most important thing is that symbol. The next thing that I think is important to us to remember about Egyptian philosophy are these water lilies and these vultures flying above the doors. You will see this Aten with the wings on either side, the vulture's wings. These were decorations. What does it say? It says that in our philosophy, in modern times, as in that day, there is always beauty that comes out of the ugliness of life. And that we believe that love is stronger than hate, and that light is better than ignorance, and that love is better than discrepancy, that equality is better than snobbishness. These are symbols of the things. I remember hearing one time, I'm not a Christian Scientist, but a hymn that they'd written about out of the dankest places grow the most beautiful flowers. That's what's represented by these lilies and these winged vultures. The next most important thing about the building are the symbols that are within these various squares. There are three. One is a house. The funny thing that kept us from breaking the code is that hieroglyphs can take many forms. Sometimes a single symbol represents a whole word. Sometimes it can represent a whole idea. Sometimes it can represent a sound, and they'll put several of them together and come up with a word, and then we have to know what that hieroglyph meant as a sound. If you see waves, it may be water, it may be the sea, it may be change. But that house represents stability. It represents those things that are good, those things that are worthwhile in life. Friendship and fellowship and fraternity and all of the things that we stand for are represented by that little house. I'm going to skip over one and go to the Ankh. The Coptic religion, when it grew up in Egypt during the earlier years of the church, adopted the Ankh as their symbol. And quite often we think of it as a Christian symbol. But the Ankh really was the key to the underworld. When Osiris has to weigh a human heart against a feather, he has first opened the door of the underworld with the Ankh. And it's, though into death, it is called the key of life sometimes. So the symbol of the vulture holding it is that Death is, yes, there, but it's also life. I'm speaking today of J.T. Nabry. I'm speaking of C.Q. Ammon. I'm speaking of Brother Walker, who was our chairman. So many. These people are no longer with us, but they're so much a part of us, and their influence lingers. Every time I stand here, I think of them and what they did for me and the friendship that we had and the discussions we had. I wouldn't be here now if it weren't for those. So you see, this symbol becomes important. But I'm going to center in on the scarab because it's the most collectible and sort of personifies all of these things put together. First, I'm going to pass around a little paperweight that has a real honest-to-goodness scarab in it. That's what it is. How does it get into all of this, and how do we have it up on our wall? Well, a basic theology in Egypt was that Ra, the great father god, had two sons, Osiris and Seth. And he sort of favored Osiris because Seth was a little wild. And Osiris was married to his daughter Isis. That was permitted in those days. And they had a son named Horus. Well, you put Grandpa with a good daughter-in-law and a son who has given him a grandson, and poor Seth gets left out. Well, Seth, being the sort of God that he was, decided that he'd get even with his brother. So he not only killed him, but he put him into 4 parts and buried the 4 parts in the corners of the earth. Isis and Osiris had 1 year to get those parts together if Ra was to resuscitate them. So 3 months they searched, and they found a 4th, and they brought it in. They searched another 3 months and found another 4th and brought it in. The 3rd and 4th times they did this, and just before the deadline, they got them all together. You know what that means? There are 4 seasons in the year. And that we trace back to the resuscitation of Osiris. Well, Osiris was given this special task of being the Lord of the underworld, the one who opens the new life to those who have gone from this life, the one who weighs the hearts and makes judgments, you know. Well, Osiris was there because his son was faithful, and Horus was so good that Ra gave him the job of pushing the sun across the sky every morning. So every morning, Horus got up, pushed the sun around. At night, he went back under the earth to take his place again for the next morning. Mother Newt, whose stomach is blue and is spangled with little stars, would spread-addle herself over all the earth to protect it at night while Horus was making his trip. Well, now we come to the tumblebug. The Egyptians saw this little bug pushing his dung ball in front of him. What they didn't know was that the dung contained the eggs of this little beetle, and that the dung itself was to furnish nourishment to these as they hatched out. They would note that the beetle would go by and dig up a hole and put the dung ball in it, cover it up carefully, then lie down and die. And a few weeks later, they'd come to the same place, and here were all these new little bugs coming out. And they said, life out of death. Spontaneous generation, we would call it today in sociology or in science. And that said, this is a symbol of life after death. So these little things became central to all of Egyptian life. You'll note that on a big one, there are carved hieroglyphics. In reality, there was only certain hieroglyphics on each scarab, And those were the hieroglyphics that denoted the name of the reigning Pharaoh. Why that? Well, because the reigning Pharaoh was a God-man. You couldn't preserve all the bodies, but if you preserved the body, the ka and the body of the reigning Pharaoh, he could come back and bring all of his people to himself and to the underworld safely. So these things become very, very important to us. The Egyptians were scattered all over the known world in their day because they were great travelers, great traders. By the way, the hieroglyphics are sort of basic to our Phoenician figures, which gave us later our alphabet. And as mysterious as they are important to us today because we might not have reading and writing if we didn't. But in biblical archaeology, because the Egyptians were all up in the Holy Land, in Syria and Damascus and the other places, if we find an ancient tomb, we look immediately to see if it might have been that of an Egyptian. Because if it were, they would have split the skin and around the area of the heart implanted a scarab with the cartouche or the name of the Pharaoh ruling on it. So that even though their body decayed, when the Pharaoh was making his rounds and bringing his dead to life, they would know that person belonged to them. So if we can find one of these, knowing the dates of the various pharaohs, we can date everything in that tomb, the time of the burial, within reasons of a lifetime, and have a guide to a lot of things that we wouldn't have otherwise. This is another symbol of a scarab. This is a rather stylized one, which shows a beetle on his foot, and the thing on the back says, "Made in Egypt." Why? Because the Mexicans and the Italians have been masters at making scarabs to sell to people. Now, there's a story behind all of this, too. JT and Maxell finally got to go to Egypt. And I said to Maxell before she left, if you find an interesting scarab, would you bring it back to me? Well, this contains one of about a dozen that she brought back in a little bag, and there was dirt with them. They were not cleaned up at all, and you'll see they are ceramic. They have been formed and fired. I said to her, "Maxell, you brought me so many, let me pay you for it." And she said, "I'd be embarrassed to tell you how little I paid for them." Well, I have some that I got when I was there a little time before that. And you're right, you can pick them up for a song unless you're in the markets in Cairo or in Alexandria. And there they know you're a tourist and, you're subject to being taken for whatever they can get. Nefertiti was probably an aunt or a relative of Tutankhamun. You know the story of this man. His father was king, and he decided that he would wipe out all of the idolatry of Egypt. He said that one God, Ra, the god of the Aten, the sun god, was the only God permissible. And for a period of his reign, he tried to force the Egyptians to be monotheists. When he died, the priest, Tutankhamun, was only about 12 or 14, we estimate. The priest decided it was time to restore their place in society, so his name went from Tutankhaten to Tutankhamun, Amun being the god of Ra. Nefertiti, though, is sometimes rated as one of the most beautiful women that ever lived. Of course, she didn't have to compete with our ladies here tonight. But this is a bracelet made out of common tin with Nefertiti's head in the middle and on different sides and scarabs on the side. This is junk jewelry that you get for very little money. Another little better metal with Nefertiti's head, and again, Aten's in this time around it. The last thing I want to show you is a few years ago, you remember that the relics of Tut came to America, and the Metropolitan Museum made an exact replica of one of the rings that was on his finger, and it's interesting because it has a swivel. And I bought this as a replica of one of the things that they found on the finger of Tut when they opened the tomb. That's probably the least valuable, but the most expensive thing that I have. In Galveston at a garage sale, I had done the funeral of a man. His wife brought his things to me and said, I want to give these to the garage sale of the women. And I looked at them. I said, how much do you want for them? She said, I don't know what they're worth. And I said, they are worth more than anybody can ever pay. And she said, do you like them? And I said, yes. She said, well, they're yours. About 1910 or 12, Egypt passed a law that no longer could things be taken out of the country, that only those things which were sold through the government could be left. I have here 2 cards that were bought somewhere at a museum. Both of them have scarabs, real scarabs, that were made somewhere before 1500 BC. When you handle these, they are 3,500 years old. They are my most cherished possessions of Egyptian things. So I will let you touch these and look at them. The little wax by them was made to show what's on the back of them, which cartouche was there. So with that, I think I will leave all of this to you and let you give me some questions if you have some. Do you understand now the meaning of that little scarab in the middle? It's a sign, man's oldest sign of belief in life after death in the Western world. It's a part of our heritage, whether we know it or not. And so all of these things are bona fide Egyptian symbols, but they still speak to us in our day. Questions? Who? All right. All right.
The colors in here are very vibrant. I was wondering if there's any significance to any particular color that are on the walls and used in the decorations.
Colors.
The colors? Oh, Egyptian colors were bright. When you go to Karnak and see the great temple there, which was made through several pharaohs' reigns, and some of the most successful pharaohs, the colors that are sheltered, because most of the roof has been gone for many, many years, and we're looking at something again that's 3,000 years old or more. Even so, what's left of the colors reminds you that colors were bright. When this was originally made, they used rather muted colors. And sometime during the period that I lived here in Galveston before 1990, they not only repainted it, but also the shades on these lamps were replaced, and a young lady put the symbols on them that had not been there before. They were rather, they fit in with the room, but they weren't nearly as pretty and bright as these. And these are not overly bright, as you know. But these colors are authentic Egyptian colors. And when they redid the room, they did it beautifully. And it is much nicer now than it was when it was finished in 1929. Any more questions?
Yes, sir.
Because the Egyptians believed so much in the afterlife, they had prepared the bodies. But why was it necessary to prepare the bodies so well?
Well, you know, we still have bodies and souls, etc., and the mythology of faith is always a nebulous thing, but they thoroughly believed that you had a body and you had a ka, that's a spirit, and that the spirit could wander, but if it didn't have a body to come back to, there was no connection with the earth. So the bodies of the pharaohs were preserved. Their names then were put on the back of the scarabs and buried with their subjects, so that when he was making his rounds, he would know who his subjects were. Being the God-man, he would resurrect his. So when you find these scarabs, they never have the same cartouches on the back normally. They'll have a one reign, then somebody else would be buried in the same area, and it'll have a different pharaoh's name on it. But these are invaluable to us because we can date the things that are in the tomb as well as the bodies or bones that are left, if there are any. But that's the importance of this, and as you see, Paul had to face this, and what is it, the Galatian letter, one of them, they kept saying to Paul, since we're dying before the return of Jesus, what's going to happen to us? We bury our dead and they go back to dust. And Paul says, look, God's big enough. He gives all things a body as it suits them. The fish have one kind, the birds have another kind, we human beings have another kind. And you can believe that God will give us a body fit for our new life when He is ready, and that it will be one that is suitable. So this idea of bodies and spirits still plagues the human mystery and our seeking for knowledge about it. We don't understand it, but Paul just said, you know, there's a body for the living, there's a body for the dead. And he left it at that because it's still a part of any of our questions. How does it all happen? We don't know. But as somebody said, I got enough to worry about. God can worry about that, and I'm sure He'll take care of it. Any more? My wife and my daughter are saying, get through so we can eat. So before we go, though, I'd like to plug the Masonic oak thing. I have about 3 things that I'm proud of in my Masonic reign. One is that I was a charter member of Anson Jones Lodge, which is now part of the Friendswood Lodge. And that is a great satisfaction to me. I was the first chaplain and chaplain for 3 years. When later Randall Briscoe became Grand Master, he allowed me to be his Grand Chaplain. And that particular year, he signed the orders for the instigation or institution of the Texas Lodge of Research. Last year, we met for the 50th anniversary. Longworth in Georgetown, Al Turquete, who was a member of this body, and myself in December were the only 3 charter members still living. Al died in December, so when we met, there were only 2, and Brother Longworth is not able to travel. So I've been the only charter member of the Texas Lodge of Research for the last couple of years, attending any of the meetings. Then Roland Maddox of this body allowed me to be his Grand Prelate. And the thing that I think that I get the most satisfaction of is that in the beginning, the Masonic Oak Pilgrimage was a joint activity of Anson Jones and Brazoria lodges. And the first one that we held, I was one of the 3 members of the committee for Anson Jones, and there were 3 members from Brazoria. And that year, I did the religious service. 5 years later, I came back from Waxahachie and did the service again. 11 years later, I did the service again as the Grand Chaplain. And Brother Gower was gracious to allow me to do it the fourth time when we celebrated the 50th anniversary of the Masonic Oak. So boys, if you get a chance to go and enjoy it for me, because I think it's one of the great gifts we have to stand where our founding fathers stood and applied for the first charter for Blue Lodge Masonry in Texas. So I'm privileged to have been a part of those things. Thank you.